With the strong support of the European Commission, Ukraine and Russia have today found agreement on their outstanding energy debt issues and on an interim solution that enables supplies to continue this winter.
Russia has reopened the gas taps to Ukraine just as temperatures are expected to dip below freezing. It's been 4 months since Gazprom, Russia's largest gas producer, cut Ukraine off amid a dispute over unpaid bills. And since roughly half of the EU's Russian supply is pumped through Ukraine, much of that region was cut off too. The three sides at the negotiating table in Brussels reached a deal last night. It guarantees Russian gas deliveries to Ukraine until March 2015. Ukraine will pay $1.45 billion immediately and then pay $3.1 billion it already owes by the end of the year. Both the EU and the International Monetary Fund say they will help Ukraine cover those bills. Russia could certainly use the cash. The country's central bank is burning through its reserves, $26 billion spent this month alone. Its economy, of course, walloped by Western sanctions, plunging oil prices and high inflation. That's all putting some intense pressure on the currency. The Russian ruble has fallen about 20% against the U.S. dollar since mid-year. To stem that weakening, today the central bank there hiked borrowing costs from 8% to 9.5%, with the goal of taming consumer inflation. That did prompt a spike for about 5 minutes. Then the ruble resumed its decline. So what does it all say about the fate of Russia and indeed Ukraine and Europe? The last word on this goes to Conrad Black. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amanda. Glad to be here.
Let's characterize first how important the gas deal is. This was obviously critical to especially Germany to get this done, but not also to Ukraine. How important is it that they brokered this agreement?
Well, it's very important to Russia and the Ukraine. I think Germany had alternate sources, but the Ukraine could have been in a rather desperate condition. But the unsung hero of this whole piece is, of all unlikely countries, Saudi Arabia, because they're so outraged at the conduct of the Iranians and the Russians supporting the Assad regime in Syria, they've resolved to bring down the oil price just by raising production. And their calculation, which is generally agreed, is that if that price goes below $70 a barrel, it puts Iran and Russia straight into the tank. And Putin's his sort of aggressive nationalist policy in eastern Ukraine ended abruptly when he saw the arithmetic on this. And that is what is really the story, not all the waffling in Berlin and Washington.
There has been this sense that OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, was in fact targeting U.S. shale gas producers, that at a certain price some of those producers are driven out of the market. And you would say no, that this is actually focused elsewhere.
There's some history to the fact that Saudis bring down the price when the Americans threaten to become more self-sufficient.
Right.
But in this case, the Americans are reducing their imports anyway. It hasn't affected their shale activities. And no, the Saudis have made it clear, and they haven't brought OPEC with them. They don't care what OPEC does. They can raise production to a point where they really can control the price. And Saudi can do fine down to $50. The great danger to those geostrategists who look at it is that the Iranians will become so desperate they'll attack Saudi refining facilities to bring the price back up and get into a possibility of a war.
You also alluded to the fact that Russia, or Putin, because I guess when we're talking about Russia, we just need to be clear, we are talking about Putin, the man himself.
A constituency of one.
There's no great kind of cabal. It's your understanding or belief that when those economics became clear, the nationalistic press into Ukraine died? I mean, can we draw a straight line between those two?
Yeah, and that's why they suddenly withdrew and pulled 17,000, an elite division, back from the border and stopped stirring up the problems in Donbass. And I don't think there's any doubt that that was the reason. It wasn't sanctions on Putin's rich friends or grumblings and complaints at the Russian embassies in Berlin and Washington.
So does that mean that we can no longer fear, as we have been, expansionist interests further into Ukraine, into other neighboring nations that had been on a sort of a short list of those of interest to Vladimir Putin?
I think it would be impetuous to assume that that threat is permanently over, but I don't think you have to fear it for the time being.
We saw what the ruble has been doing. One of the things that's been fascinating to watch about what's going on inside Russia is that it doesn't appear, if one can believe, I guess that's the question, if one can believe internal polls that come from Russia about how beloved the leader is, and I suppose that's an open question, but if we believe the numbers, none of this seems to be hurting Putin's popularity. The ruble doing what it's doing must bring back some pretty nasty memories for some Russians, if not as terrible as it once was. It must be a little uncomfortable.
No, but they've never had a hard currency there. It hasn't been a hard currency even in the time of the Romanovs. So I don't think the Russians are particularly fazed by the currency jumping around. It's hard to judge what his popularity is, but he can certainly pitch it to the old sort of holy mother Russian nationalist group. There's always in that country this contest between the nativists, who misuse Tolstoy and revere General Kutuzov and so on, and the Western emulators, starting with Peter the Great, but including someone for all his erratic and Rob Ford-like behavior, Yeltsin.
I thought you were going to go with Gorbachev, which would really, you can trash Yeltsin, but not Gorbachev to my face. That would really upset me.
I'm not trashing either of them.
Well, if you
They
call
were
them
Democrats,
Ford-esque, it's going to point some people in that
I just meant that
direction.
Yeltsin drank a lot, but so do many Russians.
Fair enough. This deal is one, mostly, as you say, most important to Ukraine, not unimportant to Europe, certainly not unimportant to kind of ease the tensions. What will take it off the table? When you say it would be impetuous to say it's off the table forever, how do we Europe resolve it?
If the Syrian problem was resolved somehow, the Saudi interest would be to have higher oil prices. I mean, in general, the Saudis, like everyone else, want to make more money for themselves. Nothing wrong with that. And so this is presumably a temporary measure. And the Syrian crisis, horrible though it is, and human tragedy though it is, won't go on forever.
And if the Russians are all too aware that this is what's going on, what does that do to relations? As you say, it could inflame tensions between Saudi and Iran. What about Saudi and Russia, or other players in the region of Russia?
Well, Russia's just kind of a mischief maker. You know, they're not involved the way they used to be. They were suppliers to Syria, and that is really the only client they've got. I mean, there's some talk about them selling some arms to the Egyptians, but
right.
Egypt's almost a basket case too, after all the problems they've had. And you see, there was a bombing in northern Sinai a week ago, 31 people dead, and the president, Sisi, said the existence of Egypt is at stake because of ISIS. The Egyptians will stay with the Saudis and the Americans and the Israelis against ISIS.
Fair enough. Back to Ukraine here. For a cost of about $5 billion, they've kicked the can on gas down the road a little bit. Will this be the beginning of many brokered agreements, that this is the end of sort of Russia using the gas taps in this way as kind of a piece of ransom?
Hard to say. I was a little disappointed that the German chancellor, who's in many respects rather an impressive leader, didn't do more to reduce German dependence on Russian gas. There are alternate sources, including ours. Now, I know, container ships aren't as economical as a pipeline, but to take that phrase from the promoters of the tar sands, it is ethical gas coming from the U.S. and Canada, and it is available to them. In the case of Ukraine, everyone hopes, or everyone in the West anyway, hopes that the new president really cleans house, and he'll get a lot of financial assistance, as we saw in the brokerage of this agreement. I mean, he's getting quite a generous aid package. And if he shapes things up and gets Ukraine functioning better, then I think it'll become less vulnerable. Certainly they're building their defense capability, and it was the great arsenal of the old Soviet Union.
That's the last word.